Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just give others a few minutes to join, but in the meantime, welcome.
Hoping that we don't have that everyone's not having issues joining here because we're just waiting on a few there. Did either of you have trouble joining with the link today?
Yes. And I have two more people trying to join that are having trouble as well. It's just sending them to the registration page. Is there anything that I can pop in the chat and share with them?
Let me pull up a quick link to make
here's
sure.
Oh, is Yufang's in?
Yufang.
Hi.
Just trying to get another link.
Yeah, not sure why that's not working.
I've got another email that I just received with a join event button. Can I email that on? Will that work?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Want me to try that?
Thank you all for your patience with this.
Hey, Luke.
Good morning.
How's things?
Good, thanks.
It's good. Just had a couple of issues with. Did you have issues joining?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we're getting there. We're slowly getting there. We might just give it another minute or two.
I had to register again.
Good. Okay. Is that what you did as well? You and Nicole had to register again?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we had a link initially that was sent out after the first registration, and then the reminder this morning, that was another link, but both of them led to the re-registration page. So we had to re-register. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. That is a shame, and thank you all for your patience.
Fortunately, we've allowed a good hour and a half for today's session. We don't think we'll take an hour and a half. We just wanted to allow time for Q&A if needed. So we should still be within our time frame this morning.
Lizzie, this is being recorded, is it? And it'll be shared presumably?
Yeah, it is being recorded and will be shared. And we'll also be sharing the presentation from today from Dr. James Wakefield.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
What I will do is now resend the link to all registrants. Apologies, you will receive another email.
All good.
Maybe just make sure that link is not this.
It is the join meeting link, not the registration link. Thank you. And we have now resent the link to all participants. With that, I think with an eye on the time, we might get underway with some of the opening comments. And I think hopefully that will give everyone time to join us while we do. So with that, good morning to those in Australia and good afternoon to those in New Zealand, and welcome to our online briefing on cosmetics across the Tasman, regulatory considerations in Australia and New Zealand. I'm delighted to be your MC this morning. My name is Andrew Bester. I'm the Senior Trade Manager for New Zealand at Global Victoria. And today's session is being co-hosted by Global Victoria and our friends at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, or NZTE. And it's always a real pleasure to collaborate with NZTE. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining this online briefing. And for me, that is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respect to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to the elders of the lands that each of you are joining from. And in particular, because we're co-hosting this with New Zealand, I'd like to extend my respects to Māori as tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, today's conversation came about from a discussion between Global Victoria and NZTE, where we realised that a lot of the companies that we all collectively work with have quite similar questions and quite similar challenges on both sides of the Tasman. Now, New Zealand and Victoria both perform really strongly in beauty, wellness and personal care, and there are some great international success stories from both sides of the ditch. And we know that jumping the ditch is often one of the first steps that a business does take on their export growth. Now, doing business between Australia and New Zealand is about as easy as it gets in export terms, but a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking that it is the same, that it is a straightforward copy-paste, and we just know that isn't the case. They are two different countries, and there are areas where regulations and systems just don't align, and these differences can create headaches, they can create costs, and they can create risks. And that is really what brings us here today on this webinar. So with that, I'll very quickly do some housekeeping, and then I'll shush and pass over to our much more important speakers. Now, we have 90 minutes today, so notwithstanding our tech issues, and thank you again for your patience, we will have ample time for presentations and then Q&A at the end. In terms of our format, I will start with a quick reading from Lizzie Moffat, Trade Manager for Beauty, Wellness, Personal Care at Global Vic, and then pass over to Bella Katz, Trade Commissioner Melbourne at NZTE, who will give a welcome from NZTE, but also a bird's eye overview of some of the common challenges that Kiwi companies have faced and that NZTE has helped those companies through. And in our keynote presentation is Dr. James Wakefield from Delphic HSE, so a real regulatory expert, and that is, of course, the crux of today. And then an element I'm really excited for, a case study from Bopo Women, giving us a sense of their experience entering the New Zealand market, which will be a fascinating case study. And then, of course, we'll close with a Q&A where you can ask your questions to any speakers. Now, we currently have you all muted. Of course, when we get to the Q&A session, we'll ask you to unmute yourselves as relevant, but otherwise do stay on mute. And you can pop questions through the chat or Q&A at any time. To sidestep what is always the first question that we get, I'm really pleased to say that Dr. Wakefield has agreed to share his presentation with you, and that will be a fantastic resource. Now, any technical issues further to this, please let us know by the chat or through email. This session is being recorded. Please keep that in mind when you have your cameras on or microphones. And yes, materials will be shared with you after the session. That is enough from me. With that, I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Lizzie Moffat, as the Trade Manager for Beauty, Wellness and Personal Care at Global Victoria. For the Victorian companies on the line, you will be very familiar with Lizzie, but Lizzie's just going to give a brief overview and welcome from a Global Victoria perspective. Lizzie, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, Victorians, and good afternoon to our New Zealand cohort. As Andrew said, I am the Beauty, Wellness, Personal Care Sector Manager within the broader e-commerce and consumer goods team here at Global Victoria. I'm going to keep this brief. I know many of you. I do want to share a bit about what we do with our New Zealand cohort. Firstly, I want to say this is a really exciting event for me because this is actually the first sector-specific event that we've hosted with a focus on New Zealand. So it's really exciting, particularly to be hosting in collaboration with NZTE as well. So thank you for agreeing to do this with us. As many of you Victorian companies will know, Global Vic has got a really strong presence globally. We've got 23 offices in priority markets, which places us really well to support our Victorian companies expand into new markets and strengthen their exports to existing markets. Over the past 5 years or so now, I guess, maybe 6 years, we've really started to develop the consumer goods, but more specifically beauty, wellness, personal care sector. You know, with the value of the Victorian BWPC exports equaling around sort of 830 million, so it's about a third of Australia's exports in this sector. it was really evident that we needed to start working with the companies and growing the sector internationally. The types of services that GV offer, I assume similar to NZTE, one-on-one tailored support with our Victorian exporters. Specifically for this sector, we make introductions to buyers and distributors. We host inbound trade missions where we'll bring buyers in to meet with our companies, host outbound trade missions, conducting market research, just a few of the things that we offer. Some of the more public activities, I guess, we've undertaken for this sector is our trade delegations to the Cosmoprof trade shows. So I think we've attended about 7 Cosmoprof editions across the sort of last few years, across Europe, the US, India, and Asia. I'm actually off to Bologna next week, so if any of you are heading over, please do stop by our stand to say hello. Look, I just wanted to give you a really high-level overview of what GV does and what we've done in this sector. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I'm going to hand back to Andrew to introduce the next speaker. So thank you all for your time and thanks for joining today.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. And the mention of numbers is a welcome one. A colleague reminded me yesterday that NZ is actually Victoria's top export market for perfumery and cosmetics. So it is quite an exciting stat, I find. With that, I'd love to introduce Bella Katz, NZTE's Trade Commissioner Melbourne and Consul General, to give a warm welcome on behalf of NZTE and also to speak to some of those regulatory challenges that she and her team have helped their Kiwi customers through. Bella, all yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. So lovely to have you all on the call. I'm Bella Katz, so a Consul General and Trade Commissioner for New Zealand, based here in Melbourne as well. Really pleased to be doing this seminar together with our super close colleagues, Global Victoria. And as Andrew mentioned, we've talked about this a lot because he sort of took some of the words out of my mouth, that we are very similar. As I'm often reminded when I go to talks, that New Zealand is in the Australian Constitution and we are always welcome to be another state, as we keep being told. So we're that close. But we're also quite dissimilar when it comes to exporting. And so like Global Victoria, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise is the trade arm of the New Zealand government. And we work with hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of New Zealand companies as they're exporting globally. We are a team that are based in Melbourne, but we've got presence across 45 different countries, and we have offices here in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. We look after lots of different sectors, so everything from food and beverage, wine, technology, manufacturing, agribusiness, and this consumer goods, this particular sector is a really important one for us. Not only does it represent a vast number of women-led businesses, entrepreneurial businesses, sometimes quite small businesses, but it's sort of the long tail of the economy. So while they're not the superstars like the Fonterras, of the world that are enormous and turning over hundreds of millions of dollars, they represent just such a large number that is just incredibly valuable to the economy. So we work very closely. We want to see them succeed. And like Global Victoria, we also do it by being kind of on-hand advisors to them. So I can see Gemma on the call. So Gemma Kyo is in the team, and Gemma works with a lot of our companies and comes from in-market, so a private sector experience, really deep understanding of the challenges that companies face. And so we work closely with them. We also help them by leading trade missions and market. We've got one coming up on the horizon for Naturally Good that some of you may know. So a trade fair that happens in Australia around that organic natural space, which is quite an important one, especially for this category. We help them to navigate the regulatory industry as much as we can. We certainly rely on experts like Dr. Wakefield. We kind of point them in the right direction rather than lead them off in the wrong area. But that is a really important sector for us. And, it is in 2024, we exported goods to the value of $6 billion into Australia. And Australia is always one of 3 key partners for New Zealand, along with China and the US. So really significant. And it's very close. But as you all know, the nuances, even state by state, doing business in Queensland, very different to doing business in New South Wales, very different to doing business in Victoria, and so on. So that understanding is so important for us to communicate. You know, this category, I looked up the numbers, and in 2020-ish, it's around $30 million. So again, it is significant, and it's changing. It grows, and it's represents really important value to the market for us. And even though Australia and New Zealand have got this really close relationship, a closer economic relationship, CER, and we've got, you know, this amazing free trade agreement, it can be really expensive for New Zealand companies to get it right in Australia. And I think what you'll see is that our New Zealand companies face a lot of the challenges that our Victorian and Australian friends do as well. So I will just give a very quick overview. I know obviously we've got our keynote that I'm going to hand over to, but also an example. So just to sort of give you a couple of the challenges for New Zealand companies in this category, it's not going to surprise you, similar to yours. So, you know, regulatory compliance, so making sure that you've got your TGA regulations all approved. Customs and tariffs is another really important issue to overcome. I mean, competition, that Australia has a lot of the global brands represented here, but New Zealand looks at Australia as sort of the number one core partner. So often for us, you're the sort of the big brother, but Australia is looking out towards the rest of the world as well for competitive products. Pricing can be an issue, distribution and logistics, even market saturation, that, you know, you're often thinking you're coming in with a niche product and find that there's about 10 other players here that are doing something really similar. And for New Zealand, it's that importation of active ingredients that can be really tricky as well. I thought I'll just highlight kind of two things that we come across quite regularly, or we see our New Zealand companies facing as issues. One is that introduction of native ingredients, so native to New Zealand ingredients. And the second one that's been a real common question for us is that changing regulatory environment around marketing claims, particularly social media. So around the native ingredients, we all know that there's a real trend and interest in new ingredients in this category. So, you know, it's a unique point of difference. It's something that is always making the products and the story behind what these ingredients are really interesting to bring to market. And there are quite a few New Zealand ingredients that have entered, that have come through with companies that you may have heard of, but that we are trying to position and make sure that, you know, there's clarity in bringing them through. So Horapito, as an example, it's like a New Zealand pepper tree, and it's antifungal, antimicrobial. It's really good for eczema and skin conditions. There's kawa, which is a traditional Māori healing plant. It's an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. Harakeke, which is a New Zealand flax, again, sort of antioxidant. Pahutakawa, some of you may know, New Zealand Christmas trees. There's an extract from that. And Manuka oil. And I know Manuka is a little bit controversial, that it's either, or we say it's a New Zealand ingredient. I know there's a story to tell there around it being Australian as well. But, you know, some of these ingredients are not largely familiar in Australia. And so depending on the format that they're coming into through the products, there have been some real issues and flags and regulatory challenges that our companies have had to face. For example, you know, biosecurity laws. So Australia overall has tighter regulations than New Zealand does. So there are really stringent biosecurity laws, and some of these native ingredients, if they're coming in a plant material raw format, they fall under a category of regulated goods that makes it quite difficult. And, you know, if the plant is used in cosmetics or food, then there's a lot of evidence that needs to be provided around the standards for safety and quality. And you all know these are really costly exercises, and often it's overlooked because it's easier in New Zealand to get that story across than it is here. Labeling and packaging, which I believe Dr. Wakefield's going to share some really important know-how on. So anything that contains these native ingredients, obviously there's a real need to have it clearly labeled and showing all the compliance with the food standards, cosmetic standards. There's a lot of bodies that you have to tick, that, you know, you have to get the tick of approval from, rather than perhaps one or two regulatory bodies that you see in New Zealand. And then, you know, the use in cosmetics around that efficacy and cosmetic claims, which can sometimes be tricky. And very expensive going through focus groups or research or scientific, scientific studies to ensure that what you're saying is correct is actually valid. So for smaller New Zealand companies, it's challenging. It's also very expensive. I mean, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And obviously where you are in your journey, you're weighing up, is it worth it just to drop ship, or should we only introduce certain SKUs that are easier rather than the vast body of our, products, because it's just too hard and too costly to navigate through this. The second thing I wanted to highlight is just around that the marketing claims. And we've had a few situations where products have had to go back to New Zealand or have had to be sort of taken off shelves because something in the labeling or in the marketing or the claim that's been put on there hasn't fit regulation, hasn't been approved. And I think, as a lot of you will recognize, when you're a small business, that social media channel is just a really core, cost-effective channel to market through. And so that landscape of changing social media claims and the regulation that's coming down on that has made it a lot harder. And I think for direct-to-consumer sales via social media could well be your core channel. And when you're running multiple markets and you may have your New Zealand social media account, you may have your Australian one, what you're saying on either of them may have to be quite different. And so again, it's just making sure that you are saying what is legally acceptable in one market that may not be in another. It's a real tightrope when it comes to walking the regulatory claims. I think, some of the examples we've had with the native herbs around these claims, perhaps horopito, you've put on your packaging that it treats eczema or treats psoriasis, that kawa reduces wrinkles, and anything like that that implies a medical benefit has to go through TGA approval. So, in some situations for a new business, this may be just generic speak, but actually when it comes into the Australian market, it's considered to be a medical claim and can be sent back and not pass muster here. So anything that's an unproved health claim, inadequate disclaimers, misleading product representations, quite sort of frightening words when you're just thinking you're an entrepreneur coming into a business with a beautiful product made out of New Zealand ingredients. I know that New Zealand has a far less stringent approach to this than Australia does. So I'm imagining that James, you've probably exported into New Zealand as well. So that may have been an easier piece for you than our exporters coming into Australia. There's no formal pre-market approval system in New Zealand. So a lot of it is happening post-market, so that monitoring post-market. Look, I'm not going to take too much more time, Andrew. So I think I also am really keen to hear from the keynote and hear from our Australian colleagues. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of the overview, just a couple of key challenges. And thank you again for joining. And as always, Andrew and Lizzie and team, it's wonderful to work with Global Victoria. So Andrew, back to you.
Thank you so much, Bella. That was a fantastic overview, and especially seeing across the really broad range of ways that NZTE works with clients and then has come across the issues across your whole client base. I found that really valuable. And interesting when you say New Zealand and Australia, that Australia is much tighter. Obviously, New Zealand and upcoming regulatory changes is something we're watching with interest to see whether that gap does close, and if it does, in what way. But with that, really pleased to introduce Dr. James Wakefield, Global Technical Director at Delphic HSE. So Delphic is a leading consultancy. They'll be familiar to many of you on the call, especially our Victorian clients, but they provide specialist product safety and regulatory compliance services. James has extensive experience in chemical toxicology and regulatory compliance, and we are really delighted to have him sharing us with that today. As I mentioned earlier, he has agreed to share his slides, which is just fantastic. And we will have lots of time for Q&A at the end. I've got absolutely no doubt there will be plenty of questions. With that, James, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's an honour to be part of this webinar. Obviously, we're very happy to be able to contribute and hopefully give you some of the ideas about where there are key differences between the regulations in Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, geographically, very close, but one of the issues when it comes to regulations is regulations vary quite significantly, and it's not necessarily all about the geography. So what we'll do, obviously, it's going to be quite top level. We've got about half an hour, so I'm not going to be able to go into all of the fine detail, but I will try and give you some of the top level things about what to be aware of about the differences, particularly with cosmetic regulations between Australia and New Zealand. So firstly, we'll start off with one of the most important points about what is and what isn't a cosmetic in Australia and New Zealand, because they're not necessarily always directly aligned. The first thing when you're thinking about a product that you're putting onto the market is how is it categorized? Obviously, we have the TGA in Australia, and then there is medical regulations as well in New Zealand. And you need to make sure, one of the things that Bella mentioned there about claims that you might make about the product that could move that into a different classification. If you're wanting to sell your product as a cosmetic, and a lot of the time it's much easier to market a product as cosmetic because there isn't the pre-market approval. But what you first need to figure out is your product actually a cosmetic? Because one of the things that a lot of people get caught out on is they have claims that they want to be able to make on the product, and unknowingly or unwittingly, it ends up being classified as a different product. And then we will just touch on the comparison of the regulatory frameworks. They are quite different about how they're regulated. So we'll just kind of give you a top level overview about how that works. Also, how ingredient compliance and safety are managed across the two regions. And one of the most important points is making sure that products are labelled appropriately for both of the markets. When you have different regulations, there's obviously different requirements on what needs to go on a product. And it's a case of understanding those different requirements to try and align those things as much as possible. There may be some cases where you can't have alignment, but what we try to do is help our clients to have alignment so that you can have one label that can be sold in multiple different markets instead of having to have separate SKUs for different regions. We'll then touch a little bit on acceptable claims and the substantiation that's needed for those, and then just finish with a summary. So firstly, what is a cosmetic? Are they the same in Australia and New Zealand? And the first point to start is the definition about what is a cosmetic. The definitions are fairly aligned between Australia and New Zealand, but there are a couple of key differences. So in Australia, it's a substance or preparation intended for place in contact with the external parts of the human body. That includes the teeth, it includes mucous membranes of the oral cavity, so it includes kind of mouthwash and oral products as well. And with a view to altering body odours, changing appearance, cleansing, maintaining them in good condition, perfuming, and protecting. In New Zealand, the definition is very similar, but there are a couple of key differences in the words. Particularly in New Zealand, it says with a view exclusively or mainly to. The purposes and the sites of applications are the same, they're aligned. But what that actually means in New Zealand is that you can have cosmetic products that have a secondary function. The point about exclusively or mainly means that you can have products, perhaps you can have antibacterial products. Depending on what you're saying about those products, if you have an antibacterial product, but the main function of that product is cleansing, that can be a cosmetic product with a secondary antibacterial function. But it depends on what you say about those. As soon as you say that something is sanitizing, then it becomes not a cosmetic. But what that actually does is it allows you to have secondary functions, and that sits there within the regulation. The definition here in New Zealand actually is directly lifted from the EU definition, but then in Australia it is slightly different. And what we will touch on about why there is a difference, it's because of the way that cosmetic products are regulated in Australia as excluded goods under the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So just to understand, if you have a cosmetic product, it needs to have one of these functions and it needs to be applied on any of those sites. So obviously anything that's used internally is not going to be a cosmetic. Anything that is having a function that goes beyond any of those purposes may not be a cosmetic as well. So it's important to understand what is your product and can it be considered to be a cosmetic to start off with. So in Australia, cosmetics are considered as therapeutic goods under the Therapeutic Goods Administration as excluded goods. So products which meet the definition of excluded goods don't fall under the view of the TGA. What that means is therapeutic goods, if you have therapeutic goods, then they are regulated by the TGA. But if you have a cosmetic product that fits within the definition of being an excluded good, that essentially means that the product is a cosmetic and there are less requirements to put in that product on the market. There are a number of factors that influence that. Mainly that's the primary use or the purpose of the product, the ingredients that are used and the effects of those ingredients, how the product's applied, how it's administered, and how it's promoted, presented, or labeled. And in particular, the claims can have a big sway in whether a product is a cosmetic or a therapeutic good. If you're claiming that a product treats something or has a will cause a physiological change, then you're most likely putting your product down the route of a therapeutic product instead of a cosmetic. But the excluded goods determination, it outlines some conditions in which a product would be excluded from being classified as therapeutic product. So you can have products with secondary sunscreen functions under specific conditions. I will touch on that a little bit because sunscreens is one that's a little bit there is a little bit of difference between the two regions. Also, products like dental bleaches and dental whiteners are excluded goods. Hair bleaches, hair dyes, hair colorants, and topical preparations for nails are considered as excluded goods, along with a lot of other cosmetic and personal care products. Within the excluded goods determination, there are a couple of lists. There's a Schedule 1 of specified goods and the Schedule 2, which are specified goods when advertised or presented for supply in a particular way. Essentially, what this means is that you can have products, it determines when products are excluded from being regulated by the TGA, as long as it meets these conditions. So in this case, there are requirements on the ingredients that are used, there are requirements on how the product is advertised, and requirements on how it's used. If it meets those conditions, it can be considered as an excluded good and is therefore a cosmetic. But if it meets if it doesn't meet one of those conditions, then it would be under the view of the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And this does get updated regularly. The last time it was updated was August last year. So there will constantly be changes. As we see with regulations all the time, regulations never sit still, and we always need to be aware of what's coming up, what changes might impact some of those classifications. But as I did mention, products intended for beauty and personal care may be considered as therapeutic if they meet certain usage criteria set out in the Therapeutic Goods Act. So the definition of therapeutic use is quite aligned between Australia and New Zealand, and essentially means that any product which is preventing, diagnosing, curing, or alleviating a disease, ailment, defect, or injury, influencing, inhibiting, or modifying a physiological process, testing susceptibility of persons to diseases or ailments, influencing, controlling, or preventing conception, testing for pregnancy, or the replacement or modification of parts of the anatomy, then the product becomes a therapeutic product. So it's important to understand if you're making any claims that could lean into any of these areas, then it may mean that the product wouldn't be a cosmetic and would need to instead be a therapeutic good. There are some products that possess cosmetic and therapeutic functions, so sunscreens in particular, where you have secondary sunscreens. A lot of cosmetic companies will add sunscreens and UV filters into bases, foundations, and things like that, because it provides additional protection. But the main function of that would be as a cosmetic if the product is a foundation. So it's understanding that categorization and where the product actually sits. Also, things like aromatherapy products and homeopathic preparations can cross that line as well. In New Zealand, products that are classified as therapeutic products depending on the claims that they make. And therapeutic is an umbrella term that covers medicines, medical devices, and other related products. And it's considered to be therapeutic when the product has one or more ingredients that have pharmacological action, the therapeutic purpose is claimed for the product, or a therapeutic purpose is implied for the product on the label or any promotional material, or it contains a medicine that's listed in the first schedule to the medicines regulation. One of the important notes between Australia and New Zealand here is that sunscreens are considered as cosmetics in New Zealand, but they're classified as therapeutic goods in Australia. So we're talking here about primary sunscreens. If you have primary sunscreens, there are sunscreen standards which are aligned between Australia and New Zealand, but the actual categorization of the products are different between the two regions. Secondary sunscreens, though, can be cosmetic in Australia as long as they have a primary function that's other than sun protection, whilst providing some protection of the skin from UV radiation. So when a product contains an ingredient with sun protection properties, the primary purpose of the product is not sun protection or therapeutic, then the products can be regulated by the AICAS and not the therapeutic goods, excluded goods determination. To be considered as a cosmetic, a secondary sunscreen needs to then meet some criteria. It needs to meet the definition of cosmetic under the Industrial Chemicals Act. It needs to meet any requirements that set out in the therapeutic goods excluded goods determination. And if it doesn't comply with any of those, then it must be listed or registered in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Staying with sunscreens, the SPF, the sun protection factor, needs to be determined according to the AS/NZS standard. So it is an aligned standard in Australia and New Zealand, but classification is different. So in Australia, the classifications by the TGA based on some different categories. So there are excluded sunscreens, which are typically cosmetic sunscreens, which have secondary UV benefit. So they have a primary cosmetic function with then a secondary sunscreen benefit. Exempted sunscreens, anything with an SPF that's less than 4, not considered to be a sunscreen, so it's exempted. And then you have listed therapeutic sunscreens, which include only ingredients which are already permitted, and indications, therapeutic indications, which are permitted. There is the regulation on permissible ingredients and permissible indications for therapeutic goods. So as long as it meets those indications which are listed there, then it can be a listed therapeutic sunscreen. If it contains ingredients or indications other than those that are expressly permitted, then it would need to be registered, and it would need to go on the Australian the ARTG as on the Register of Therapeutic Goods as a registered sunscreen. There is some guidance on those categories from the Australian regulatory guidelines for sunscreens, and I've put the link there as well. There's a lot of different conditions that need to be met in order to fit in those different categories. But it's important to understand that for Australia, there could be different categories of therapeutic goods, or whether it's a secondary sunscreen that could be excluded. Whereas in New Zealand, all cosmetic or all sunscreens are cosmetic products, so they need to comply the same. So now just touching on a comparison between the regulatory frameworks, and there is quite a bit of difference between the way that cosmetics are managed in Australia compared to New Zealand. Within Australia, there is no single regulation that covers all aspects of cosmetic safety and compliance. There isn't a cosmetic regulation. There is obviously the Therapeutic Goods Administration, but then with cosmetics being considered as excluded goods, they sit slightly outside of that. So there are a number of different things, a number of different organisations which feed into different parts of safety and regulatory compliance. So there's the Australian Industrial Chemicals Introduction Scheme. I will talk a little bit about that in a second. the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and they're mainly responsible for ingredient compliance. TGA also involved in labelling and claims as well. And then the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission involved in product safety and labelling and claims, and the National Measurement Institute involved in labelling and claims, particularly to do with net contents declarations. So there are also within those bodies a number of different regulations, a number of different texts which set out different areas that need to be complied with. One of the main ones is the Industrial Chemicals Act, but then there's also the Therapeutics Goods Act, the Excluded Goods Determination, which we've talked about. There's also the Standard for the Uniform Scheduling of Medicines and Poisons, the SUSMP, or the Poison Standard, which also has some impact because there will be some ingredients which will be listed on the Poison Standard with specific conditions. There's the Competition and Consumer Act and the Australian Consumer Law, and the Cosmetics Information Standard, and then the National Measurement Act and the Trade Measurement Regulations. So as you can see, there are lots of different texts, and sometimes it can be a little bit tricky trying to unpick which parts of those regulations apply in which areas to certain products. One of the things I did want to touch on is the Australian Industrial Chemicals Introduction Scheme. Because there isn't a cosmetic regulation, for example, with prohibited and restricted lists of ingredients, most of the regulatory effort, or most of the focus on whether ingredients can or can't be used, comes under the Australian Industrial Chemicals Introduction Scheme, or the AICS. This was implemented in July 2020. It was an update from NICNAS, but it manages the introduction of industrial chemicals. So any product that is imported into Australia is considered as an introduction, and it's the ingredients within that themselves which are considered as the introductions. So if you're introducing a cosmetic product, then you need to consider all of the ingredients, all of the substances that are within that cosmetic product, about whether they're listed on the AICS and what category they're listed in. There may be obligations for you to report information to the AICS about how much of that substance is being imported on an annual basis. There are introduction categories. If a substance is already listed, then it can be introduced. You should keep records of that, but there will be some cases where there are certain conditions for those introductions. So understanding your introductions under the AICS is quite important to make sure that you comply and make sure that you're keeping on top of record keeping and information that needs to go to the AICS. There will be some cases where you have novel ingredients which aren't on that list, and they may need to undergo assessments. You may need to provide quite extensive toxicological dossiers in order to support the use of those ingredients. So it's important to understand that is one of the things that we help our clients with as well, because it can be a bit of a minefield trying to understand all of those different things. As we touched on, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and obviously cosmetics being excluded goods, but the main point is determining whether a product meets the requirements under TGA or considered to be excluded. There is also, as I touched on, the classification of controlled medicines and poisons. So the poison standard, it's an important text to make sure that if you're using certain ingredients and there are certain conditions about why they're listed on the poison standard, there may be certain requirements about how the ingredients are used, how they're sold, the concentrations that they can be used at, or some of the warnings that might need to go on the products. So it's important to also understand that. When you can see that there's a list of the different schedules from the poison standard here. Any ingredients which are used in cosmetics can only be those ones that are listed in schedules 5, 6, or 7, but there will be specific conditions. So anything that's listed within those, there may be certain requirements on warnings, there may be requirements on maximum concentration. There may be substances that fit in multiple different categories, but it sits within one of the different schedules if it's used at a certain concentration. So it's important to understand that. And also, as we touched on, sunscreens, they also come under TGA. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission is responsible for product safety. That includes cosmetics, and it sets out a consumer guarantee on products and a mandatory reporting of adverse effects and product recall processes. They're responsible for product labelling, in particular around country of origin claims, and the mandatory standard on cosmetic ingredient labelling. And then the National Measurement Institute is responsible for product labelling, in particular the information that should be on pre-packaged goods that are imported into Australia, and names and addresses for packers for articles that are packed in Australia. Now moving on to New Zealand, and this is where it becomes quite different. The legal authority for cosmetics in New Zealand is the Environment Protection Authority. There are some other agencies that are responsible for some areas, the Ministry of Health, particularly with protecting public health and surveillance of hazardous substance injuries, and some of the territorial authorities if they have defined responsibilities that are not taken up by any other agency. But there is actually one text in New Zealand, which is the Cosmetic Product Group Standard. So it's a specific cosmetic regulation in New Zealand, and that sits under the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act. And there's been a decision to update this standard fairly recently. That was published on the 30th of January, 2024. And the changes will apply from the 1st of January next year. And any products which don't comply with the updates must not be sold in New Zealand after the 1st of January 2027. So that's important to be aware of. There are some changes coming up with some of the ingredients that are listed and permitted, or any of the restrictions within the cosmetic group standard in New Zealand. A lot of those are aligned with the EU cosmetic regulation. So those of you who are familiar with the EU cosmetic regulation, there is a lot of similarity between that, particularly with ingredient prohibitions, restrictions, and things like that. And it's an element of keeping that updated. But there are some changes as well. It's not just a word-for-word translation or adoption of that. There are some differences, which I will touch on. So the Cosmetic Product Group Standard is one text which covers primary issues relating to cosmetics, including compliance with EPA notices around labelling and advertising, notifications, in particular for products which contain nanomaterials, and handling of products, in particular packaging, disposal, storage, and restriction of use, safety based on the principle that cosmetic products should not cause harm, and the requirements on prohibited and restricted materials. I will now touch on how the ingredient compliance is managed between Australia and New Zealand, because again, there are quite a bit of differences. So there aren't any lists of prohibited, restricted, or permitted cosmetic ingredients in Australia, but the importer or manufacturer should review a number of different things. So one of the first things to look at is the AICAS inventory. So there could be specific obligations. There may be requirements about how those chemicals are used in certain products. Then the SUSMP, the poison standard, there may also be labelling and usage restrictions under that due to the hazardous nature of some of the substances, and also the ingredients that are classified as therapeutic goods that need to be checked against the excluded goods determination. Here's just an example of a listing from the AICAS. It's a little bit small, but hopefully you'll be able to see. And the AICAS inventory is a database of 40,000 chemicals that are available for industrial use in Australia. There is a public list and there is a confidential list as well. You can search the public list. One of the first things to do for all of your ingredients is look to see, is it on the AICAS list? If there is an entry for it, then you need to look at the information there. In particularly about the defined scope of it assessment. There's an example for a substance called diammonium hectorite, and it has a defined scope of assessment, which means that it's listed on the AICAS when it's been assessed as a component of dermal cosmetic products at a concentration of no more than 2%. If you're using it at 2% or less, then that's fine. You don't need to do anything else. If you're using this ingredient in a cosmetic product at more than 2%, then you may need to consider the categorization of that. You may need to provide more information to the AICS in order to support that use. So that's probably one of the first places to look to see our ingredients restricted in Australia, because there isn't a defined list about those. In New Zealand, as I touched on, it closely follows the EU cosmetic regulation, and there are a number of schedules which set out, in particular, prohibited materials, restricted materials, color additives, preservatives, and UV filters. So these can all be found in one place. It's actually much easier to then search through those ingredients to see, are there any restrictions related to the ingredients that you're wanting to use. Schedule 4 is, as I said, prohibited materials. So these are ingredients which cannot be intentionally added to cosmetic products. There may be trace levels of some of these ingredients, but in that case, you would need to be able to support the safety of those ingredients. But there are, in the new update to the group standard, 1,694 entries that are on that list, which are ingredients that cannot be used in New Zealand. It's very similar to the EU annexes, but there are 2 additional entries of ingredients which can't be used in New Zealand: methyl methacrylate and PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, which are, there's a lot of news about PFAS at the moment. There's potential concern around endocrine disruption, and there's a lot of agencies and authorities around the world that are looking to restrict those. So that's going to be added as part of the new update, that any substances which are classified as a PFAS will automatically be prohibited from use in cosmetic products. And then restricted materials, and this is where there are ingredients which can be used, but there are certain conditions about the use. It could be concentration, it could be certain warnings that need to appear on the product. It may be that they can only be used in certain types of product. So it's important to understand that the ingredients comply with those. There are 324 entries there, which again, similar to the EU Annex 3, but there is a key difference. In the EU, the limit for butoxydiglycol is 9%, but because in Australia, butoxydiglycol is permitted at 10%, the New Zealand regulation has been changed, so it permits butoxydiglycol at 10% instead, to allow alignment. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to have products that are aligned across the 2 regions. There is an additional entry that zinc pyrithione can be used at 0.1% in leave-on hair products. It's also a preservative, so there's some separate conditions there. Color additives, there are 153 entries. So these are color additives. So if you're claiming a color additive, you're using a color additive with the function of adding color to the product, you can only use the ones that are on the list. There is an additional entry, which is mica. In the EU, they don't consider mica to be a color additive. It's considered to be a bulking agent. So in the EU, you shouldn't add mica as a may contain pigment on your product with a plus or minus, but they're similar to you would with other color additives. But in New Zealand, you are allowed to do that. Mica is considered as a color additive. Preservatives, there are 60 preservatives that can be used. And again, you can only use the ones that are on this list. So if you're adding an ingredient to add preservative function to your product, it needs to be one of the ones on the list. So you can have ingredients which also have preservative functions, but the main preservatives that you're using within the product need to be the ones that are on this list. There is now an additional entry for zinc pyrithione when it's used in rinse-off products or for hair products with specific concentrations. And then also UV filters. So UV filters, obviously, when it comes to protecting the consumer's skin from UV radiation. This doesn't necessarily apply when you have a UV filter that's added to protect the color of the product, to stop it from changing color through the life cycle of the product. So any UV filters that are intentionally added to prevent UV exposure to consumer skin should be one of the ones on the list. There are 34 entries, which are similar to the EU annex, but because of the difference in regulations between sunscreens in Australia and New Zealand, there are actually 6 additional substances which have been added to the New Zealand cosmetic group standard to allow alignment of products between Australia and New Zealand. So important to understand that if you have these UV filters, you can use these additional UV filters for Australia and New Zealand. That doesn't then mean that you can also sell that product in the EU. So you can only, if you then have this amazing product that you decide that you want to sell to EU, you need to also make sure it complies with the EU. So just because the New Zealand regulation is heavily based on the EU, it doesn't mean that it's directly aligned. You can have some additional things in New Zealand that you couldn't in the EU. So just another consideration if you're thinking beyond that. Just touching on product safety in Australia, it's under the Australian consumer law that a cosmetic product must be of acceptable quality. It should be safe. It should be lasting with no faults. It should look acceptable and do all the things that someone would normally expect the product to do. But the ACCC don't prescribe any mandatory testing for cosmetic product, and it's basically done on industry best practice guidelines. When we are substantiating the safety of cosmetic products, we do what's called a cosmetic product safety report. It's a toxicological risk assessment that proves that the product can be safe for the intended consumers. And that's one of the ways that you can support the testing. But there isn't any mandatory testing. There isn't anything that says that you have to do it in a certain way, but you should be expected to be able to demonstrate that a product is safe. And also suppliers are required to report any product-related death, serious injury or serious illness that is associated with a cosmetic product. Hopefully that's not going to happen, but obviously if it does, there are requirements to report things. And in situations where a recall is necessary, then suppliers are required to notify the Commonwealth Minister within 2 days of initiating any voluntary recall action. In New Zealand, the cosmetic product group standard has an overall requirement that cosmetic products don't cause harm, but it doesn't specify the safety measures that need to be taken. So it says that products must not cause damage to human health when applied under normal or reasonably foreseeable conditions of use. So you need to think about who your consumers are, how the product's going to be used, how people might use the product, even if it's maybe used slightly differently to the instructions that you're provided. But we can't ensure that every single product is safe. If somebody decides to eat a product, for example, then that falls outside reasonable or foreseeable use. So we need to consider if a product is being used as it should be expected to be used, it should be able to be safe. But again, it's the responsibility of the manufacturer or the introducer to demonstrate that a product is safe. And that's something that we support a lot of our clients with as well. Now on to labelling of products for Australia and New Zealand markets. And again, as you can see, there are some differences between the regulations, so there may be some differences between the labelling, but it is fairly straightforward and it can be easy to align the requirements between the two. So it's not very often that you would need to have a specific product for Australia and a specific product for New Zealand. You can quite often have alignment of the artwork and the labelling information that goes onto those products. As we said, in Australia, there is no overarching regulation that covers labelling and packaging requirements, and there are multiple different regulations which cover different requirements. But the basic principles are ingredients listing, and the standard for ingredients listing is that the ingredients should be listed in descending order down to 1%. Anything that's less than 1% can be reordered how you see fit within that band of all of the ingredients that are below 1%. And any colour additives can be added to the end. So any colour additives that have a CI number, for example, can all be moved to the end regardless of what concentration they are, even if they're more than 1%. There's requirements to include the country of origin. There's requirements for the net contents declaration, and there are also standards about how you should express the units there as well. So I can't go into all the detail now because there's a lot of different things to dial into, but there are requirements under there about how the units should appear. Supplier name and address, any efficacy claims, if you're making efficacy claims, and any safety warnings that need to be used in order for the product to be used safely. And the information needs to be provided in English. In New Zealand, the labelling of cosmetic products needs to comply with the Hazardous Substances Labelling Notice 2017, as well as having the following label elements, which include the product name, ingredient listing. Again, the ingredient listing standard is the same of descending order down to 1%, and then you can reorder those ingredients if you wish. Also includes a requirement to include a batch code for traceability, instructions for warning and warnings for safe use, recommendations for disposal of the product and packaging, and New Zealand importer, supplier or manufacturing details, which should be sufficient to contact in person by telephone, in person or by telephone. One of the interesting things about this, because it comes under the Hazardous Substances Labelling Notice, that should be on there if the product is a hazardous good or it contains an ingredient that is considered to be hazardous. So the intention is that even if the product itself is not hazardous, if there are ingredients which are classified as hazardous, then you should include a New Zealand contact details on there. So for cosmetics that aren't classified as hazardous and don't contain any hazardous ingredients, technically you're not required to include a New Zealand importer details, but the New Zealand EPA do encourage that is included on all cosmetic products. And again, the information should be provided in English. And the labelling requirements do not need to be met if the product is a free sample or a tester. So that's just something to be aware of there. But one of the main points here is, although you don't need to register your products, those of you who are familiar with the EU regulation where you need to have a responsible person who's based in the country. In New Zealand, you don't need to register your products before you put them on the market, but there should be a New Zealand importer if it meets those conditions about being considered as a hazardous good. So just something to be aware of. But there is also a caveat in the Hazardous Substances Labelling Notice that those requirements don't need to be met if the labelling is compliant with the current labelling requirements for cosmetic products of Australia, US, Canada, UK, or the EU, as if the substance were for sale or supply in those jurisdictions. So you can see there's a bit of a get out of jail free card because if the products are labelled for Australia and comply with the requirements for Australia, then they can also be sold in New Zealand. It's also worth noting that despite the difference in classifications for primary sunscreens that are cosmetics in New Zealand, if a cosmetic in New Zealand, a primary sunscreen, is labelled in accordance with the Australian Therapeutic Goods Order, then it can still be sold in New Zealand to allow alignments of products across both markets. So it's easier then to have a product from Australia that's labelled in accordance with Australia and go to New Zealand than it would be to go the other way. There may be then some considerations if you're going from New Zealand to Australia instead. So that does allow a bit of help there, but it's also something to still be aware of. Okay, now going to touch on acceptable claims and substantiation. I don't have too many more slides, so we would go through now. So claims in Australia set out anything that's a claim is anything that's included on the labelling, which can be a word, a sentence, a paragraph, a photo, or even something that's implied from the way that the product's presented. Under the Australian consumer law, you cannot make false or misleading representations about goods, and you must not engage in misleading or deceptive conduct in relation to a claim about a good. And the ACCC has extensive investigative powers and can serve a substantiation notice in order to check a claim. If they see a claim that they want to say, okay, we're not sure about the efficacy data, or we're not sure about the substantiation data that you have for this, then they can actually submit a notice and ask to see the information you have in order to support that claim. So it's important to understand that any claims you're making need to be able to be backed up. You should have substantiation information to be able to support those. And businesses have a responsibility to ensure that the claims they make are accurate and backed up by adequate scientific and/or technical evidence. For efficacy claims, the substantiation of efficacy claims is a requirement and they must remain within the scope of cosmetics, otherwise it may reclassify the product as a therapeutic good. As I said, the line can be fine, and it depends on the type of product and what you say about the product, about whether it's classified as a cosmetic or a therapeutic good. An example here is if you have a toothpaste, then toothpaste under the excluded goods determination are restricted only to oral hygiene and the use of fluoride to prevent tooth decay. So you can say that a toothpaste product cleans teeth and freshens breath, that's a cosmetic. If you say that it prevents gingivitis and gum disease, then that's a therapeutic claim and it becomes a therapeutic product. So very much depends what you say about the products can determine the classification. In New Zealand, there is little specific information around claims, but again, the general principle is that claims should not be false or misleading, particularly where claims may pose a risk to the health of consumers. Claims need to be suitably substantiated again, so you need to be able to have evidence for the claims that you're making. There are no requirements to register claims prior to sale. A lot of the investigation is done post-market. So a case of looking at claims that people are making and then seeing, hang on, is this something which can be supported? Is there sufficient evidence for this? And one of the things that we often look at is the EU. There's a lot of information going on in the EU about acceptable claims and the action that different authorities are looking at whether claims are considered to be acceptable. And that's something that we use in order to apply to different regions. So as with Australia, you need to be careful about claims which could extend beyond the scope of cosmetics and could infer a therapeutic purpose. Now, just touching a little bit on supplements, because we were asked about supplements as well. If you have supplements that are making only cosmetic claims, a lot of cosmetic beauty brands now are wanting to provide supplements to go along with their products. But it's important to understand that anything that's orally ingested cannot be a cosmetic. Even if you're only making cosmetic claims, it can't be considered as a cosmetic product because it's ingested orally. So they would, in Australia, legally declared to be therapeutic goods in Australia under the Therapeutic Goods Declared Goods Order. So they can't be regulated as foods or cosmetics and must comply with therapeutic goods legislation when they're labelled or promoted for cosmetic claims or when they're used, advertised or presented for oral consumption. And those products should normally be included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods as low-risk listed medicines, and you can only use the claims from the permissible indications determination. Also in New Zealand, supplements that only make cosmetic claims would also not be cosmetics since oral ingestion is beyond the scope. Instead, they're regulated under the Dietary Supplement Regulations, which sits under the Food Act. So that's important to understand there that if you have supplements that you're wanting to sell alongside your cosmetic product, even if you're only making cosmetic claims, they will likely need to follow different regulations beyond the cosmetic ones. And now just touching on claims, particularly around social media. At the moment, there isn't any specific guidance, but there are, as Bella mentioned, some information coming out around claims on social media. Generally, again, the same principles that should apply for products, that claims should not be false, misleading or deceptive. Claims need to be substantiated and they shouldn't infer a therapeutic benefit or physiological change. In TGA, there is the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code, which, although it doesn't apply directly to cosmetics, it does set out some guidance which can be used. In particular, there is some guidance on testimonials and endorsements, where it sets out who can make testimonials, who can make endorsements, and the kind of information that can be included within those. So that can be used as reference, but it is an area which is evolving all of the time, and you need to think not only about the information that's on your product, but what people are saying about your product. Obviously, if somebody picks up your product and decides to review your product online, then that's completely different. If you're providing it to somebody to review, then that's considered an advertisement. So you need to consider, does it consider it as an advertisement, or what are people saying about your product, particularly if you have influence over what those people are saying. Just to finish with a quick summary, I've just put together a table which just sets out some of the differences or some of the alignments between the two regions. So in particular around categorization, that cosmetics are excluded from regulation as therapeutic goods in Australia, but primary sunscreens are therapeutic goods, whereas in New Zealand, cosmetics are regulated under the cosmetic group standard and sunscreens are cosmetics. When it comes to ingredient management, you have the AICAS inventory and the poison standard in Australia, whereas you have the schedules of the cosmetic product group standard. For safety, it doesn't define how you support safety, but you're expected to be able to evidence safety. When it's labeling, it can be aligned in New Zealand, expressly permit cosmetic products to be labelled in accordance with Australian cosmetic compliance requirements. When it comes to notification, there isn't any requirement for notification of products in either region, but you are required to report the use of industrial chemicals that you're using, that you're importing in Australia, if they are the ones that require reporting to AICS. So it's important to understand your reporting obligations for all of the ingredients, and it's based on the use of that ingredient across all of your products. And the only reason that you would need to notify a product in New Zealand is if your product contains nanomaterials. So there is a requirement, if you contain nanomaterials, you need to expressly list that the product contains nanomaterials on the ingredient list, and those products also need to be notified to the EPA. And when it comes to claims, the Australian consumer law sets out the requirements that they shouldn't be false, misleading, or deceptive. In New Zealand, there isn't any specific definition, but generally the principle is aligned with Australia. So thank you. I know I've taken a little bit longer there. There's a lot of information to unpack, and it's still kind of top level. There's a lot more detail that we could go into, but I hope that it's been helpful for you to just understand where there are some differences, where there could be challenges. But obviously, we've got a question and answer session a bit later, so happy to take any questions that anybody has a bit later as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. I see applause coming through in people's reactions, and that is very befitting. We gave you a tremendously broad brief and not a huge amount of time to do it, and I learned a huge amount through that, so thank you. That was fantastic. Look, our next speaker is another James, which makes my life particularly easy. This one is James Gilson. He is the operations manager at Bopo Women, which is a skincare brand that celebrates self-love and natural beauty. Look, I'll leave James to tell his business story in his own words, but we are really grateful for him for coming today to share his story, particularly with their NZ market entry, and in some of their wins, some of their challenges, and some of their lessons learned along the way. So, James, thank you, and over to you.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Well, thanks very much for having me speak, Andrew. So I'm James. My wife, Bronwyn, and I started Bopo Women, a women's skincare company back in 2019, but we only really started to explore the potential in exporting during a trip to Bologna and London with Lizzie and the team at Global Vic in 2023. And for us, like the biggest question and hurdle with export was always just logistics. So not as much the marketing and sales side of things, but inventory, preparing our operations for scale, understanding the different regulatory requirements in each country, like James was talking about before, as well as just how to physically get the products into market. So that Bologna trade mission, I think, really honed our thinking around export. And strangely enough, that it was probably that trip that was the catalyst for us deciding to start our export journey in New Zealand. We listened to various experts on that trip, and we talked to a lot of brand owners who told us, first of all, that they, some of the brands had lost money in the first 2 to 3 years of exporting over there. So it's obviously a huge investment and lots of things can go wrong. It's a slow process, but also just the significant changes they need to make to their packaging to get into the EU and UK being a sort of a major barrier to entry and making it a bigger investment of time and money than perhaps some other places. So it made us sort of decide to de-risk our strategy a little bit. And we decided to start with New Zealand first, a small, close, friendly neighbouring country that we felt would allow us to make mistakes, but small, manageable mistakes, and required less significant changes to our packaging up front. Just the batch numbers actually that James mentioned earlier. I think that's the only thing we really changed was we had a little barcode machine. We put the batch numbers on the bottom of our boxes now for the products going to New Zealand. So I'll start by going over just the steps that we took to enter the New Zealand market, and then I'll go through sort of, we're obviously in our infancy stages of learning how to export, but a year and a half now we've been in New Zealand, but I'll go through the steps we've taken to enter that market and then the lessons that we've learned since then. So we launched in New Zealand in late 2023, and the first step we took was just working out the packaging changes, as I mentioned before, and then we engaged a 3PL in New Zealand to handle all of our dispatch to stockists in New Zealand, and we sent that 3PL 5 pallets worth of stock. So once they were all stocked up with our stuff, we then exhibited at a trade show in Auckland in late 2023, and that landed us quite a healthy number of stockists around New Zealand. And then subsequently to that, our wholesale manager here in Australia would manage all of those new relationships and processed wholesale orders and things like that for us in-house here in Australia. So that was essentially just us replicating the strategy that had worked here in Australia, and we thought, we'd sort of basically rinse and repeat in New Zealand. So since that trade show in late 2023, our sales were really strong. We probably did better than we thought we would do from that trade show. But then we felt like as 2023 moved into 2024, our reorder rates in New Zealand were a little bit slower than the order rates, say, that we were used to with our Australian stockists. And then on top of that, we were getting some issues with our 3PL. There was a lot of damage in transit, some delayed things going to the wrong places, just issues that we weren't used to because most of the dispatch to date we'd handled ourselves in our Australian warehouse here, had a lot more sort of control over that. And so then around that time, sort of mid last year, July, around then, a distributor from New Zealand approached us. And we decided then that despite the lower margins inherent in that model, the benefits in terms of less admin overheads for our wholesale manager, not having to manage the 3PL issues, and the potential for faster growth and scale with New Zealand stockists just made that transition to a distributor worth it. So we made the shift, I guess, then from that in-house management with a local 3PL in New Zealand to a full New Zealand distributor who handled all our business development, sales, relationships with the stockists and processing orders, and then ultimately dispatch as well. And so since partnering with that distributor in July last year, we've been shipping palletized freight to them every month. Our sales have grown rapidly, and we're probably, I'm not sure exactly, but I think we've probably quadrupled the number of shops that we're actually stocked in New Zealand. So it's been they've delivered on their promises, I guess you could say, and it's been a more successful experience for us than that initial approach we took with the 3PL, and we don't have those delivery issues anymore either, because obviously the distributor handles all that for us. So that's the journey we've been on so far in the last year and a half, let's say, with New Zealand. But now I'll just summarise sort of what we've learned to date, keeping in mind we're still just, sort of wetting our feet in this space and not experts by any stretch. But I think the overall takeaway for us is if you're an Australian brand, it really is a great place to cut your teeth with export. Like, we were profitable there from day one, which was a bonus, but we've learned a lot, and we feel like because of New Zealand, we're more prepared and ready to tackle some of those, Asia, India, and ultimately US, UK, Europe markets, which are, bigger, more daunting, and I'm sure James will attest to require a lot more upfront effort with respect to changing packaging and things like that. So in terms of the key lessons we've learned, like the first one is just export logistics can throw up challenges, which we knew that this would happen. It's why we started in New Zealand, but we encountered various little nuisances, I'd call them, say, with the New Zealand shipments. So, we had a few pallets going out to New Zealand that we didn't have the correct stamp on the side of the wooden pallets, which we didn't even know you needed that for exporting pallets. But turns out you do. They were turned around. We had to repack them, cost us a couple of grand and a few weeks of delays. Not a huge headache, but it would have been a bigger headache if it had been a larger shipment to, say, the UK or Europe. So it was nice to learn that lesson in that way. A number of our products have dried flowers in them, and we didn't realise, but to export those products, and I've subsequently found out it's not just New Zealand, it's a lot of markets, you need certificates from the individual manufacturers of those flowers, basically guaranteeing that they've been treated in a certain way so that they can be exported. So we had a shipment turned around because of that, and again, costs and delays. So just little lessons, and there's a few other ones like that I feel like you can do, as much research as you want, but sometimes you've just got to kind of get your feet dirty and learn the lessons the hard way. And now we know, and going forward, we don't make those mistakes again. So another lesson we've learned that I touched on earlier is using a 3PL in another country, but managing those wholesale orders in-house in Australia just wasn't for us. I talked about the 3PL damage issues earlier, which I think you could probably just find a better 3PL and iron those problems out. But for us, it was more, we felt like we were leaving food on the table with that approach of managing it all in-house here in Australia, but using a 3PL. I think we just weren't as good at managing the New Zealand stockists as we were at managing the Australian stockists. And maybe that was, just a cultural nuance sort of misunderstanding of different things. Like a lot of our Australian shops, we give exclusivity. So we'll give them 2 kilometres or up to 10 kilometres as exclusivity from other competing shops. And we started doing that in New Zealand. But of course, the people listening from New Zealand will know, like, it's a much smaller country. So you can't give too many shops 5 or 10 kilometres radius before you've taken up a far more significant chunk of the country, and there's not a lot of space left for new shops. So that probably leads me on to the next key lesson, which has been, for us, working with a distributor has been fantastic, and it's ironed out a lot of those problems. They don't even do postcode exclusivity. So, they understand that the New Zealand market is a small geography, and they probably get the expectations of shops there a lot better than we did. That's just one example of probably how they manage it better than we were doing. So I think with respect to the distributor, the number one lesson, I guess, is just understanding your COGS and negotiating margins with them, and also the fixed cost requirements. So we send pallets to them. We're responsible for paying to get those pallets from our warehouse into their warehouse in New Zealand. And so obviously just having that really robust understanding of your own COGS, the fixed costs, and then kind of baking those into the overall cost so you can get a gross margin on each sort of pallet or pallets that you're shipping becomes more important than ever. And another key lesson we learned working with the distributor was, if your brand has significant seasonality, which Bopo definitely does, it's mayhem here from September to December, I would definitely recommend trying to engage that relationship with the distributor off peak. So at a time where you're not super busy, we started working with them just before the Christmas rush, and obviously we had no idea of order sizes, order frequencies. And so just in terms of resourcing staff in the factory and warehouse downstairs, it's just a little bit more difficult. And they obviously, they grew the brand very quickly and they were super excited, but we were sort of running around chasing our tails here, trying to make it work. So it would have been a lot more, I think, far more optimal had we started that relationship off peak from Christmas. Another positive thing, I guess you could say, that we've learned is the products can handle price increases to the recommended retail price. So whereas in Australia, we've socialised our shops and our customers with a price point that's hard to change more than 5%, let's say, due to the novelty factor of Bopo and any brand, I guess, from Australia being a foreign brand in a new country, and the fact that the shops and customers there aren't that familiar with it, you can increase the price point, and we did that. And it helps the distributor with their 30% margin or whatever the margin is that they need, but it also helps us, the brand, retain a bit more margin on our end as well. So, there's a flex. I think we charge about, once you convert to Australian dollars, about our price point in New Zealand is about 15% higher recommended retail price than our price point is in Australia. So I think that's pretty much it. I mean, in summary, from our perspective, I think New Zealand is just the perfect layup for an Australian brand. It taught us how to export palletized sea freight. It taught us the importance of, all the negotiating distributor margins and just how that distributor model works in general. And I think, ultimately, as I said before, we just feel a lot more prepared to take on some of those bigger, larger markets overseas, like the UK and US and Asia, that require a larger upfront investment. So yeah, I think that's about it from me, Andrew. Sorry if I've waffled too long, but I thought I'd try and keep it somewhat short and sharp.
No, that was fantastic. And look, I'm thrilled we managed to get you to speak, because what you've just outlined, I mean, one, it's amazing to hear it from the coalface and not from us, but that is so much of how we position New Zealand as that first export market and springboard. And I wouldn't be surprised that NZTE would do similar with clients coming to Australia. And to hear you outline in your own words exactly how that is obviously seeing great success in NZ, but then helping you look further afield, it's magic to hear. So I really enjoyed that case study. Now, with that, we turn to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. We don't have as much time as we anticipated, but there is certainly the opportunity to ask your questions now, and then of course we'll share contact details afterwards as well. If you have any questions, do throw a hand up right away or jump into the chat function and put them in. And while you do that, I might start with one of mine to James Wakefield. We do have to clarify that, don't we? So we've looked a lot at the cosmetic side of things. Let's say a company does decide they do want to make the therapeutic claims or tip from the cosmetic side over there. What does that do to their costs and timelines? Like in practical terms, obviously, if there's an option to look cosmetic, that is better. But for whatever reason, a company doesn't want to, what's the actual impact of that? What does it look like for them?
Yeah, obviously it's down to you as a brand. If you want to make a therapeutic claim, then that's fine. You can do that. What we're not saying is that you can't make therapeutic claims, but if you do make a therapeutic claim, then your product is going to be a therapeutic good, which then means it needs to go through all of the approval through the TGA. That means it's a much longer process. There's a lot more that's involved with doing that. So it depends as a brand if that's something that you want to do. What we try to do is help people to navigate that line, because obviously cosmetics there's a lot less regulatory burden for getting a product on, which obviously means it's quicker, it's cheaper to be able to get cosmetic products onto the market, as long as you do it right. But then going through a therapeutic good. So if you have a therapeutic good and you're adamant that you want to make a therapeutic claim, that's fine. Just be prepared that it will cost more and it will take longer to get through those processes, to get it as a listed therapeutic good, to list on the register of therapeutic goods. And the same in New Zealand as well. If you've got a therapeutic good, then it needs to be follow the requirements there as a medicine. So it just about the length of time that it takes in order to get those products to the market, the cost that's involved with that. And there may also be some additional kind of reporting requirements and things on top of that as well. So it's really just about speed to market. If you have a product already that's a cosmetic, you're not making any therapeutic claims, or if the claims that you're making can be softened so that they do fit within the cosmetic space, it's much easier, it's cheaper and quicker to get the product onto market in the first place. So, but it really depends on you as a brand. If you're adamant that you want to make therapeutic goods, then that's absolutely fine. Just be prepared that it might take longer.
Thank you. So it really comes down to big cost benefit analysis. You'd want to have very strong reasons for wanting to make those claims. Yeah. I will bite my tongue on any follow-ups and hand over to BFix. I see we've got a hand up.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's been great. I'm new to this, so I was writing everything really down. So I'm here in New Zealand, and I don't know much about it, but if tomorrow I want to take my product to Australia, would it be any way that I can send my labeling and somebody can check my artwork and tell me, yes, no, do this, do that, do the changes, instead of me reviewing every single article and regulation and everything to make my life easier?
Obviously, that's a service that we do provide for clients. We look at regulatory compliance and safety in a lot of different markets around the world. And one of the first things that we say is, if you have a formulation and you're thinking about exporting it to another market, that's something that we can help to review about whether the ingredients are legally permitted, if you're using everything within the right concentrations, and then what needs to go on the product. There may be specific warnings for certain countries. There may be certain requirements about what needs to go on the label, the ingredients label, and everything like that. So that's certainly something that we do for all our clients, and it's usually the first step that we look at. And if anyone is developing a product, then it's always good to think to the future about where might you want to sell that product, because that can save you some issues for reformulation and things later down the line, where you decide, you realize you've got a really great product that people love, and then you want to export it to other regions, and then realize that there's a reason that you can't do that because of some ingredients that you have or some change in a regulation that's coming up. So it's about looking as far into the future as possible. You may not know, if you want to start off, you've got a product and you want to sell it in Australia and New Zealand, it's better to have that smaller scope. But if you think about, in the future you may want to export to other markets, or you need to better understand the differences between those two markets, then that's certainly something that we can help with. But it's starting very much with the formulation right at the start to say, are all of the ingredients legally permitted according to those regulations, and can we support them as being safe for the intended use?
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'll say on behalf of Global Victoria, we obviously aren't able to go into that level of detail. It's not our scope of expertise. The experts like James are absolutely our first port of call whenever businesses are looking for support around that. Now, I see we have just ticked over time, but I will make one last call. Are there any other questions for any of our speakers today? Well, I think I've given you an uncomfortably long period of time. It certainly felt that way to me. So I think that says both our Jameses, Bella and Lizzie, have covered everything we needed them to in their presentations. We will share James's slides after that. They do contain his contact details. You've obviously got a sense of what kind of services are offered. Everyone, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your patience with some of the tech issues at the start. This has been wonderful. I'll quickly jump off to say, Nicole, I see a hand.
I was just saying thank you, but I hit the hand instead of the clap. Apologies.
Not at all.
Thank you to everyone. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Nicole. A massive thank you to all of our speakers, to Lizzie, Bella, James, and James. This has been a fantastic session from my perspective. Really grateful to all involved. Thank you all. We will leave it there.
Thank you very much.
Guys, thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.